Kuhn is trying to say creativity usually is not. Right? And that in fact, most artists, and I think the abstract expressionists themselves would agree, are doing something in which they're playing carefully with a received tradition and with the problems that tradition is allowing them, like a microscope or telescope, to be able to perceive. So what makes the structure of scientific revolutions then so radical? Again, part of it is that he's changing the name, the sort of rationale of the word revolution itself. Right? Revolution originally instantly just means a circle back to as things were. It was the English Revolution. Then in the French Revolution, it means to come a decisive transformation, right? And here, he's taking this a couple of steps further, right? There's another use of the word revolution as the Industrial Revolution, a technological transformation of society. But here, what he's done is done something quite different. He's saying there's a revolution within the structure of science. And that revolution within the structure of science can be studied and analyzed, and if we look at that, that will give us a new definition of creativity and a new definition of what science is in the first place. And that becomes sort of the focus of his essay. With that, he sort of, again, focuses on this notion of paradigm shift. But for paradigm shift, he wants to say something very specific. Namely, he wants to say the key thing that was missing from science of the sort that psychologists were studying in Alta in Utah was history. And this is where I get my title from. He says, this is the very first sentence of the book. History, if viewed as a repository for more than anecdote or chronology, could produce a decisive transformation in an image of science by which we are now possessed. And if you'll notice and look back in Essential Tension, he has a lot to say about science textbooks, how crummy they are, what's terrible about them, what the problem is with science textbooks. What's his problem with science textbooks? I mean, they seem to represent in both texts, actually, the problem he has with the image of science in his day. And what seems to be the issue there?
Well, doesn't he say that science textbooks are problematic because they just show the exact information as has been passed down is the paradigm of the day, and don't actually educate kids on how to sort of develop on that? They just say this is the problem and this is how it was solved, as opposed to how it might be solved in the future, or teach exploratory things.
Yeah, he says basically presents it. I mean, in the Essential Tension, it's almost like a comic presentation, right? Because he says on one hand, the problem with the way you're teaching science is that it has nothing to do with the way science is presently being done. It just presents science as a settled body of information, and that settled body of information is more or less sort of revealed through the process of science as getting things correct. And within that, there's a cumulative development. But within that, what will be the function of history? Essentially nothing, right? History is just the history of people not getting it right until they get it right. So your textbook doesn't even have to present why you would study history or what history is. And it's a comic presentation, even as he says that, which is a pretty scathing judgment. He says, nonetheless, this mode of teaching science has been tremendously productive, right? Which is just sort of an odd turn. He says, even simply in drilling this into people's heads, it forces them to try to match theory to fact in an ever-reducing sort of try to reduce the distance between the two. And in that, it sort of inadvertently creates a moment of creativity when those two don't match. But basically, he's going to say we need to step back and look at how this has happened in the past, and we'll see the historical development of that, in fact, has been a creative process in itself. And that science textbooks don't show us that, but that's what the process of science has been. And that's why he says at the beginning of the next paragraph, even from history, that new concept will not be forthcoming if historical data continue to be sought and scrutinized, mainly to answer questions posed by the unhistorical stereotype drawn from the science text. Right? And so his goal will be to say, what we need to do is think about this as a historical development. Why would that matter for present science? I mean, if on one hand he's saying, it worked pretty well in the past, actually, to study science, and just, many of you I'm sure have taken science classes, where this is exactly what you do. You just need to learn all of the basics of organic chemistry or physics in order to get to a certain point. And he's saying that actually works pretty well for what it does, but it actually is really bad for explaining scientific creativity. Why would that be? I mean, what would be missing in this concept? Or what would history do for science in a positive way? Let me put it another way. How does this sort of change the role of the scientist? Yeah?
Would it provide the structure he says was lacking before, when good science can be created, get recreated out of chaos, but through trial and error? Would looking at history look at errors that have been posed, and then from there, create things?
Yeah, I mean, that's going to be a big part of it. I mean, basically, he's going to say, once you know this has happened before, he's going to say not just as a coincidence, but as a fact, your present science will have gaps and will have mistakes in it. And when you see the past, you'll be able to see that what counts as reality in 1800 actually had a fully legitimate structure. And this will be a key part of his argument, as I'll turn to in a second. A fully legitimate but different structure. And if you want to make the next big move in science, and this is what makes the book a bestseller among scientists, you need to figure out how these structural transformations occurred. You need to look at the sociology of what happened, what kind of people come up with this, what their role is, what their position is. That's how you get at the creativity of this. But then even more importantly, this is a way of changing what you think of as science altogether. Science is not a one-to-one copying of the outside world. What he's going to say is that science is instead a creative, pragmatic interaction with that world, in which there might be further ways of doing things. And for Kuhn, this is obvious in a way it wouldn't have been for somebody 100 years before, right? Kuhn is somebody who's educated as a physicist. He starts to work in the history of science actually as a summer job, and starts to look at Aristotle and says, wow, actually Aristotle was really smart, and people doing Aristotelian science were not stupid. And yes, they were displaced by Newton, but I'm trained to be a theoretical physicist, so I'm studying Einstein. So I know that Newton was displaced by Einstein. And that suggests to me that it could be that Einstein gets replaced by somebody else, that person gets replaced by somebody else. The process could keep going on and on. Science enters history, right? Science is not just sort of unveiling something that's always been there. It's a creative process that certainly reveals consistent truths. I don't think Kuhn, although he has some more extreme statements, I don't think he would disagree with that. But he would say those consistent truths can be understood differently in the same way as the Gestalt image can be understood differently. And in that way, he's going to say the image of science itself is the decisive transformation. Any questions about that? That then is going to be sort of what makes, if nothing else, I mean, if you don't want to do science, you want to write bestsellers, right? This is a good way of thinking about writing a bestseller. He's now explained to the scientist and the artist. So you want to be creative, you want to be the next Watson and Crick. I'm going to show you the ways these things happen. But with that, he's also introducing a change into essentially American and Western society of saying, we've always thought of science as something in which we got it right, and people in the past or people in other cultures did not. I'm instead going to show you a way of thinking about science where we're making very coherent, powerful connections in the world. And they're doing us a lot of good, but other people made very coherent and productive connections in the world as well. Right? The Polynesians had a far better system of navigation than anybody in Europe, from 1000 AD onwards. The Mayans had a better system of mathematics. And he's going to say it's not coincidental. Because what they were doing, what they had worked quite well. Similarly, our science is one moment of this, and we need to look at this as a developmental process. That then is going to be sort of the basis of what he considers as the foundation of his paradigm shift. But he's going to say, for this reason, there's a couple of elements that go along with it. One will be that the concept of paradigm also means an example within the shift itself, right? That is, a paradigm shift happens because you have enough examples, enough sort of elements of that gestalt that then start to fall into place so that you can make sense of something and so that it has a meaning for you. Just as for instance, a famous side example of this, when Galileo first started to talk about the role of the tides being based on the moon and gravity, the church outlawed any reference to the tides. They say you talk about whatever else you want, but don't talk about the tides. Because every fisherman, everybody who lives near the sea, knows where tides are. And if they start looking at tides and thinking of your theory, and thinking of planets, and basically confusing our entire notion of the world, that's a problem. Those would be paradigmatic examples in Kuhn's case, right? This is what he would call a paradigmatic example. Similarly, for any given science, we'll say there's a number of paradigm examples that essentially cement people's way of looking at the world, right? It's a paradigm example that obviously the Earth is the center of the universe because we see the sun go up and down every day. And clearly it's circling us. That's a paradigm example. It sets in place a paradigm along with many, many other details in which you think it makes complete sense for the Earth to be the center of the world. And his point was to say all those examples will always have gaps. And the point of the scientist is to find the gaps in the present examples, right? For Einstein, it's finding gaps in the Newtonian theory by saying, okay, we're having a problem with electromagnetism. What if it's not, in fact, that the constant in the world is absolute time and space, but the constant in the world is light and the speed of light, right? That's changing your paradigm and changing your paradigm examples. let me get a little bit further into then some of the examples of what happens to Kuhn when he starts to make this transition. And I think that will make the example a little bit clearer. And then we'll talk a little bit more about what this would mean in terms